Raphael Carmine had killed men for far less than what he was witnessing right now. The keys slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor of his Lake Forest mansion with a sound that echoed through his skull like a gunshot. Miranda had 14-month-old Asher by his tiny arm, shaking him so hard the baby's head wobbled, his screams piercing the air while formula and spit up stained her $5,000 Valentino like evidence at a crime scene. "What the hell is this, Miranda?" His voice dropped to that dangerous register his enemies knew meant death was coming. She spun around, releasing Asher so fast the baby nearly collapsed, her perfect face shifting from rage to honeyed innocence in a heartbeat. "Raph, baby, I didn't hear you come in. He just spit up everywhere and I was trying to." But Hazel was already there, the young nurse in her faded blue scrubs sliding across the marble on her knees, catching Asher before he hit the ground and pulling him tight against her chest. "Breathe, sweet boy. I've got you. Just breathe with me." The baby's desperate wails softened to hiccups as he buried his face in Hazel's neck, his tiny fingers gripping her collar like she was the only safe thing in his world. How many times? Raphael thought. How many goddamn times has this happened while I was out building an empire? "She's been doing this for months, Mr. Carmine." Hazel's voice was steady, fearless, looking him straight in the eyes despite knowing exactly what he was capable of. "Every time you leave this house, she either ignores him crying for hours, or she does this." Miranda's mask cracked, her amber eyes flashing with something cold and calculated. "You're going to believe the help over me, Raph?" His gaze moved from his son trembling in Hazel's protective arms to the woman he'd shared his bed with for 6 months, and for the first time, he saw the monster he'd been too blind to recognize. If this story already has you on the edge, hit that like button and share it with someone who can't resist a dark romance. Subscribe now because what Raphael does next will change everything. The choice he made in the next 60 seconds would either save his son or destroy the only woman brave enough to stand between a monster and a child. Raphael didn't say a word. He pulled out his phone and called Griffin, his voice cold as steel as he ordered him to bring every second of security camera footage from the house over the past 6 months to his office immediately. Miranda stood there, her amber eyes flickering as she tried to read the situation. She stepped forward to touch his arm, but Raphael took a step back as if she were something filthy. "Honey, I can explain," she said in the sweet voice that once made him soften but now only made his stomach turn. Raphael didn't answer. He turned away and climbed the stairs, each step heavy like a stone pressing down on his chest. In the dark office, with the curtains drawn tight, Griffin appeared only 15 minutes later, the loyal right hand setting a laptop on the desk and beginning to open file after file of footage. Raphael sat there, both hands gripping the leather chair so hard his knuckles turned white, watching each frame as if he were swallowing poison 1 pill at a time. The first month, Miranda left Asher crying in his crib for 3 hours while she lay on the sofa scrolling through her phone. The second month, she screamed in the face of a baby barely 8 months old because he dropped his bottle. The third month, she shoved Asher to the floor when he crawled too close and wrinkled her dress. And in every piece of footage there was Hazel, the young nurse with brown hair and green eyes, rushing in to pick Asher up, soothing him, wiping his tears while Miranda turned away. 6 months, Raphael whispered, his voice shattering like glass. 6 months my son endured this, and I didn't know a thing. Griffin stood silently beside him, having followed Raphael since they were young soldiers in his father's empire. And this was the first time he had ever seen his boss look like a broken father, rather than a mafia king. Raphael stood and walked back downstairs, finding Miranda sitting in the living room with a glass of wine in her hand as if nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled seductively, about to speak, but Raphael slammed the laptop onto the coffee table in front of her, the screen frozen on the image of her shoving Asher down. "Explain it," he said, his voice so low it was almost a growl. Miranda stared at the screen, and in that moment the sweet mask completely collapsed. She set the glass down and stood, her amber eyes turning cold as ice. "Fine, Raph," she said in a completely different tone, hard and calculating. "You want the truth, then here it is. I hate that baby. He's the only thing standing between me and the position I deserve." Raphael felt his blood boil, his hands clenching until his nails cut into his palms. "But you can't leave me," Miranda continued, stepping closer with a confidence that made his skin crawl. "My father is Harrison Vance. The Miami Alliance is what keeps the Carmine Empire standing on the East Coast. What do you think will happen if you throw me out like a dog?" She scoffed. "War, Raph. War is what will happen. And are you really willing to trade everything just for a baby who can't even talk yet? Raphael looked at the woman in front of him. 6 months ago, he thought she was perfect, beautiful, intelligent, well-connected. But now all he saw was a venomous snake that had slithered deep into his own den. He stepped close enough that his face was inches from hers, his voice no more than a whisper, yet enough to make Miranda step back. You think I'm afraid of war? You think I built this empire by running? I'm Raphael Carmine. I've killed more people than you have years on this earth. And if you think I'll let anyone, including your father, threaten my son, then you've misjudged the man standing in front of you. Miranda swallowed. For the first time, he saw a flash of fear cross her eyes, but she still tried to steady herself. You'll regret this, Raph, she hissed. I promise you, you will regret this. Raphael didn't respond to Miranda's threat. He simply turned to Griffin, who stood motionless, like a statue in the corner of the room, and gave a single decisive nod. Griffin stepped forward. He didn't need to ask what his boss wanted because 20 years at Raphael's side had taught him to read every order through nothing more than a look. Get her out of my house, Raphael said, his voice flat like a frozen lake. She has 15 minutes to collect her personal belongings. Anything I bought for her stays. Miranda recoiled when Griffin moved closer. She turned to Raphael with eyes now blazing with furious outrage. You can't do this to me, she screamed, her shrill voice echoing through the vast living room. I'm Miranda Vance, Harrison Vance's daughter. Who do you think you are to treat me like this? Raphael didn't move. He stood there with his arms folded across his chest, his face cold as if carved from marble. I'm the man you dared to touch my son, he replied, and that's all you need to know. Griffin grabbed Miranda by the arm and began dragging her toward the stairs. She struggled, her red-painted nails clawing at his hand, but Griffin didn't even flinch. She kept screaming as she was hauled upstairs to get her things, curses and threats raining down like the cries of crows in the night. You'll die for this, Raphael Carmine, Miranda shouted from the staircase. My father will burn your empire to the ground. You'll lose everything. Do you hear me? Everything. Raphael remained still. He'd heard too many threats in his life to not know that the loudest voices usually belong to the most frightened people. 15 minutes later, Griffin dragged Miranda out through the front door. She managed to take only a small suitcase and her Birkin bag, her Louboutin heels clicking sharply against the stone steps, as she was shoved toward the waiting car. Before the door slammed shut, Miranda turned back to look at Raphael standing in the doorway, her amber eyes burning with something poisonous. I'll come back, she snarled, and when I do, you'll beg me for forgiveness. The car tore off into the night, and Raphael watched until the taillights vanished beyond the iron gates. He let out a long breath. It felt like he'd just pulled a venomous thorn from his chest, yet the wound was still there, bleeding and aching. He turned back inside and climbed the stairs, his feet carrying him to Asher's room as if pulled by an invisible thread. The door was slightly open, and he stopped when he saw Hazel sitting beside the crib, gently soothing a sleeping Asher, her slender fingers stroking the baby's soft black hair. Raphael stood in the darkness of the hallway, unwilling to break this rare moment of peace. But Hazel noticed him. She rose and stepped into the hall, closing the door softly behind her so she wouldn't wake Asher. They faced each other in the dark corridor, moonlight slipping through the window at the far end and falling across their faces. She's gone, Raphael said, unsure why he felt the need to report this to the nurse. Hazel nodded but didn't speak. Her green eyes met his without fear, just as they had when she stood in the living room and accused Miranda to his face. I need to tell you something, Mr. Carmine, she said, her voice quiet yet firm as steel. Raphael folded his arms. He was used to people bowing their heads before him, but this woman seemed to have no idea what fear was. I'm staying for Asher, Hazel said. Not for your money, not for this mansion, but because that child needs someone who truly loves him. She paused for a beat, then continued, her voice hardening. But if you bring any other woman like Miranda into this house, if you let anyone hurt Asher even one more time, I'll take him, and you'll never find us. Raphael raised an eyebrow. For the first time in many years, someone had dared to threaten him and look straight into his eyes while doing it. Are you threatening me, Ms. Monroe? He asked, his voice dangerous yet strangely free of anger. I'm telling you the truth, Hazel replied. And if you're as smart as people say, you'll understand that isn't a threat. It's a promise. She turned and went back into Asher's room, leaving Raphael alone in the darkness with a strange feeling he couldn't quite name. Perhaps respect, perhaps admiration. Or perhaps something far more dangerous than either. A week passed, and the Lake Forest mansion felt as if it had shed an old skin. There were no more sharp high heels clicking across the stone floors. No more heavy Chanel perfume clinging to the hallways. No more irritated sighs every time Asher cried. Edith, the housekeeper who had served the Carmine family for 20 years, told Raphael that the house could finally breathe again. But the biggest change came from Asher. On the first night after Miranda left, Raphael woke at 3 a.m. out of habit, because that was usually when his son would start screaming. Yet the mansion was eerily silent. He shot out of bed, his heart racing as he rushed to the nursery, his mind spinning through every worst-case scenario. But when he pushed the door open, he saw Asher sleeping peacefully in his crib, his thumb tucked into his mouth, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Hazel sat in the armchair by the window, having fallen asleep with a book open on her lap, moonlight spilling across her delicate face and softening her features in a way Raphael had never noticed before. He stood there for a long moment, watching the two peaceful figures in the room bathed in silver light, and a strange feeling swelled in his chest, as if this was the family picture he had always been missing without ever realizing it. In the days that followed, Raphael found himself coming home earlier. He told himself it was because business had stabilized, but deep down he knew he was lying. He came home early because he wanted to see the way Hazel cared for his son. She never held Asher with the detached efficiency of the nannies before her. She spoke to him as if he understood every word. She read to him even though he was only 14 months old. She sang lullabies in a warm, low voice that made even Raphael want to close his eyes. One afternoon, he stood outside the kitchen and watched Hazel feed Asher. Her patience seemed endless as the baby kept spitting the food out. She only smiled, wiped his mouth, and offered the next spoonful. "You're doing so well, Asher," she said encouragingly. "One more spoon for Hazel, then we'll go look at the goldfish." Asher beamed, a smile Raphael had rarely seen in the past 6 months, and the baby opened his mouth for the spoon as if it were the best thing in the world. Raphael felt his chest tighten. He had hired countless nannies with impressive degrees, years of experience, flawless recommendations, yet none of them had ever made his son smile like this. And a question began to gnaw at his mind. Who was Hazel Monroe? Where did she come from? And why did she care so deeply for a child who wasn't her own blood? That night, Raphael called Griffin into his office. His right hand stood before the desk, waiting for orders as always. "I want to know everything about Hazel Monroe," Raphael said without looking up from the papers in front of him. "Where she was born, who her parents are, her education, what she did before coming here, whether she has any connections to gangs. Everything, Griffin. I want to know everything." Griffin nodded without asking why. 20 years beside Raphael had taught him that his boss always had a reason. "I'll have a report for you in 2 days," he said before turning and leaving. Raphael leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness, wondering why he was so curious about the young nurse. "She's just an employee," he told himself. "Just a girl paid to care for his son. Nothing more." But the image of her sliding on her knees across the marble floor to catch Asher kept resurfacing in his mind, along with the fearless look in her eyes when she met his gaze and threatened to take his son away. "Hazel Monroe." Raphael whispered her name into the dark. "Who are you?" Griffin returned exactly 2 days later, carrying a black leather briefcase, stuffed with documents, and wearing an expression Raphael rarely saw on the hardened face of his right hand, a somber look touched with something that resembled compassion. Raphael sat behind his walnut desk, dusk settling outside the window while the light from crystal chandeliers cast warm golden streaks across the room. "Report," he ordered, his hand reaching for the glass of whiskey on the desk. Griffin opened the briefcase and began, his voice flat and steady, like reading an obituary. "Hazel Monroe, 28 years old, born and raised on the south side of Chicago, specifically Englewood, one of the poorest and most dangerous areas of the city." Raphael raised an eyebrow. The South Side wasn't known for producing gentle nurses with warm smiles. It produced gangsters, addicts, and nameless bodies. Griffin continued. "Her father left when she was 5 years old. No one knows where he went or whether he's still alive. Her mother, Dorothy Monroe, was a severe alcoholic, worked as a waitress at a cheap bar until her liver failed. She died 13 years ago." Raphael stayed silent, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his glass. "She had a younger brother," Griffin said, pausing briefly as if weighing his words. "Jonah Monroe, 5 years younger than her. She raised him from the time he was 10 after their mother died. Raphael noticed Griffin was using the past tense, and a heavy feeling began pressing against his chest. Jonah Monroe, Griffin went on, got involved in gambling at 16, owed money to a small gang operating on the South Side, the Westbrook gang. The debt amounted to $50,000. Raphael frowned. Westbrook. The name sounded familiar, as if he'd heard it somewhere long ago. She worked 3 jobs at once to pay off her brother's debt, Griffin said, his voice lowering. Night shift nurse at a clinic, waitress during the day, and janitorial work in an office building on weekends. She almost paid it off, and then they tripled the interest. Raphael tightened his grip on the whiskey glass. He knew how loan shark gangs operated. They never wanted their prey to be free. 3 years ago, Griffin said, his voice dropping further. Jonah Monroe was found at a landfill in the southern part of the city, 20 years old, shot 3 times in the chest. No witnesses, no suspects. The case was closed after 2 weeks. Raphael closed his eyes. The image of a young woman receiving a call from the police, telling her that her brother was dead rising in his mind, and he wondered how she had screamed, how she had collapsed, how she had forced herself to stand again when there was no one left in the world for her to lean on. After that, she nearly fell apart. Griffin continued. There's a record of her staying at a homeless shelter for about 6 months. It appears she came very close to ending her own life. Raphael opened his eyes, his hand tightening around the whiskey glass until it nearly cracked. But she stood back up, Griffin said, with a trace of admiration in his voice. She went back to nursing school, completed her degree, worked at Cook County Children's Hospital for 2 years before switching to private nanny work because it paid better, and then she came here. Raphael sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything he had just heard. A girl from the hell of the South Side, father gone early, alcoholic mother, brother murdered, nearly suicidal. Yet she still stood up and became the woman he saw every day, the woman willing to slide on her knees across marble floors to save his son, the woman who dared to look the Chicago Mafia boss in the eye and threatened to take his child away. Is there anything else? He asked. Griffin hesitated briefly before speaking. There's one more thing you should know. The Westbrook gang, the ones who killed her brother, do you remember them? Raphael frowned, trying to recall. 2 years ago, Griffin reminded him, they refused to pay their percentage to the Carmine Empire and dared to interfere with one of our shipments in the Southern District. You ordered them wiped out. The memory hit like a cold wave. Raphael remembered now. A swift operation. 12 Westbrook members dead in a single night, no trace left behind, just one of hundreds of routine actions carried out by the Carmine Empire. He had destroyed the people who killed Hazel's brother without ever knowing it. Raphael sat there in silence, unsure what he was supposed to feel. Guilt for indirectly creating her pain through the loan shark system his empire protected. Relief that he had avenged her without realizing it. Or fear at the realization that she was living under the roof of the man who ruled the world that had taken her brother from her. Does she know? He asked Griffin, his voice rough. There's no evidence she knew who you were before taking the job, Griffin replied. But there's also no evidence that she didn't know. Her motives are still unclear. Raphael nodded and waved Griffin away. Alone in the darkness, he looked down at the whiskey glass as if answers might be found at the bottom of it. Hazel Monroe, the girl from the South Side with fearless green eyes and a heart large enough to love the child of a stranger. Was she here because of Asher or for some darker reason? And why, even knowing she could be dangerous, did Raphael find that he didn't want to let her go? 3 days after receiving Griffin's report, Raphael still couldn't look at Hazel without thinking about Jonah Monroe, about a young body dumped at a landfill, about a girl forced to identify her brother's remains at a morgue. But that night, every thought of the past was pushed aside when Asher's cry tore through the mansion at 2 a.m. Not the soft cry of hunger or the needy whimper for comfort, but a sharp, piercing scream of pain that jolted Raphael awake as if he'd been struck by electricity. He rushed into his son's room and found Hazel already there, holding Asher in her arms, her face drained pale with worry. He has a high fever, she said the moment she saw him, her voice trembling slightly. 104 degrees. I gave him fever medication, but it hasn't worked yet. Raphael felt his heart constrict. His son lay in Hazel's arms, his little face flushed red, sweat soaking his hair. Tiny gray eyes squeezed shut in pain. Call a doctor, he ordered, but Hazel shook her head. I already did. Dr. Richards is on his way. But he said if the fever doesn't come down within 2 hours, we have to take him to the hospital. 2 hours, 120 minutes, that could decide the life or death of his child. Raphael had never felt so powerless. He was the head of the largest underworld empire in Chicago. He could order anyone killed, destroy anything. Yet he couldn't do a single thing to bring down the fever of a 14-month-old baby. Hazel began wiping Asher's body with a warm cloth, her movements quick but gentle, her lips constantly whispering soothing words into the child's ear. Raphael stood beside her, feeling useless, until Hazel looked up at him and said, "Can you talk to him? Your voice will help calm him." He sat down beside the crib, took his son's small burning hand, and began to speak. He didn't know what to say, so he talked about meaningless things, about the first car he ever bought, about the first time he saw Asher, after he was born, about the way Isabel had smiled when she chose their son's name. Hazel kept wiping Asher's skin, and that was how they stayed. 2 adults fighting a child's fever in a room, bathed in warm golden light. Dr. Richards came and left after confirming it was just a common viral fever. The medicine would work, but it would take time. Time, the thing Raphael hated most because he couldn't control it. 3 hours passed like 3 years. Asher cried, then slept, then cried again. Hazel changed the cloths, gave him water, checked his temperature, while Raphael sat there holding his son's hand and praying to a god he didn't believe existed. At 5 in the morning, Hazel took the temperature one last time and let out a breath. 100.4 degrees, she said, exhausted but relieved. It's coming down. Raphael felt as if his entire body were being taken apart piece by piece. He hadn't realized how tightly wound he was until the tension finally released. Asher fell into a deep sleep, his breathing steady, his face no longer flushed. Raphael and Hazel sank down onto the floor, their backs resting against the crib legs, both too exhausted to bother standing. They sat there in silence for a long while, their shoulders nearly touching as the room slowly filled with early light. "Thank you," Raphael said at last, his voice rough from sleeplessness and emotions he didn't know how to name. Hazel turned to look at him, dark circles beneath her green eyes, yet they still held a gentle light. "It's my job," she replied. "No," Raphael shook his head. "You did more than that. You cared for him as if he were your own child." Hazel was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "I know what it feels like to have no one beside you when you need it most. I don't want Asher to go through that." Raphael looked at her, and maybe because he was too tired, maybe because his defenses had collapsed after a long night, he asked without thinking, "You're talking about your brother, aren't you?" Hazel stiffened briefly, and Raphael knew he'd gone too far, but she wasn't angry. She only sighed and looked toward the window where dawn was beginning to tint the sky pink. "You investigated me," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "I investigate everyone who lives under this roof," Raphael replied, not apologizing because it was the truth. Hazel nodded, as if she'd expected that. "So you know about Jonah," she said, her voice softer but steady. "I know," Raphael answered. They were silent for a long time, only Asher's steady breathing filling the space between them. Then Hazel spoke, her voice sounding as though it came from a very distant place. "He was only 20, she said. "He was foolish and reckless, but he was all I had. I raised him after our mother died. I thought I could save him. I thought if I worked harder, earned more money, I could keep him safe, but I failed." Raphael said nothing. He just sat there and listened, for the first time in many years listening to someone without calculating what they could offer him in return. "Your wife?" Hazel asked suddenly. "What happened to her?" Raphael was surprised by the question. No one dared ask him about Isabel, not even those closest to him. "Her name was Isabel," he said, surprised to hear how his own voice softened. "She died when Asher was 8 months old. Postpartum complications the doctors didn't catch in time. One day she was here, the next day she was gone." "I'm sorry," Hazel said quietly. Raphael looked at her, and in the first light of a new morning, he saw a woman who had lost everything yet still stood upright. Just like him, 2 broken souls who had somehow found each other in the room of a sleeping child. The distance between them was only a few inches. He could smell baby milk on her shirt, see the delicate blue veins on her wrist, count each curved eyelash framing eyes that were looking straight at him, but neither of them crossed the line. They just sat there in silence, 2 strangers who had become a little less strange, until sunlight flooded the room and broke the fragile moment. Miranda Vance wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat in silence. 2 weeks after being thrown out of the Lake Forest mansion, she sat in Pierce Sinclair's penthouse in Manhattan, sipping champagne and recounting her injustice with the perfect expression of a victim. Pierce Sinclair, the Mafia boss who controlled most of the East Coast, had been the sworn enemy of the Carmine Empire since Raphael's father was still alive, and he had been waiting for this opportunity for many years. "What do you know about that nanny?" Pierce asked, his cold gray eyes lighting up with interest as he listened to Miranda talk about Hazel. "She's cheap trash from the South Side," Miranda replied with open contempt. "No proper education, no family, nothing at all. And somehow she managed to get into Raphael's bed just a few weeks after I left." Pierce scoffed and reached for his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Let me give you a hand," he said. "The Carmine Empire has a few people I bought a long time ago. It's time they earned their pay." And so the rumors began to spread like a disease. In dark bars where Raphael's men gathered after work, whispers started about the mysterious nanny. Some said she was Sinclair's spy, planted in the mansion to collect information about business routes. Some said she was a professional gold digger who had slept with at least 3 previous bosses to climb her way up. Some said she was using the baby to manipulate Raphael, a fox wrapped in sheep's wool. The rumors reached Raphael little by little, through the averted gazes of his men, through conversations that abruptly fell silent when he entered a room, through the strange hesitation in the voices of people who had been loyal to him for many years. He knew who was behind it all, Miranda and her poisonous mouth, but he hadn't expected the rumors to spread so fast and sink so deep. Griffin reported that at least 5 people within the inner circle had begun questioning Hazel's loyalty, and some even questioned Raphael himself, suggesting that the Carmine boss might have been so bewitched by a nanny that he'd lost his judgment. Raphael swallowed his anger and continued business as usual. He didn't want to overreact, because that would only give the rumors more weight. But the storm finally broke one Friday evening during the weekly meeting with his captains. They sat around a long oak table in the secret meeting room, behind an Italian restaurant Raphael owned, 12 men in expensive suits with guns hidden on their bodies. The meeting proceeded normally until Raphael mentioned strengthening security at the mansion, and a man named Russo, the captain in charge of the Western District, suddenly spoke up. "Boss, forgive me for being direct," Russo said with a mask of respect. "But is this increase in security meant to protect that nanny?" The room fell into a deadly silence, every eye turning toward Raphael. He sat there, his face unreadable, but inside his blood was boiling. "What exactly are you implying, Russo?" Raphael asked, his voice dangerously calm. Russo swallowed but pressed on, perhaps out of naivety, or perhaps because someone had promised him something in exchange for this question. "I mean," Russo said, "there are many rumors about her, that she might be Sinclair's person, that she's manipulating you, and as someone loyal to the Carmine Empire, I believe I have the right to be concerned." Raphael didn't answer. He simply stared at Russo with eyes as cold as ice, and in that stretched silence the entire room seemed to stop breathing. Then Raphael picked up the whiskey glass in front of him and hurled it straight at the wall behind Russo. The sound of shattering glass exploded like a gunshot in the enclosed room, shards and liquor spraying everywhere, a few drops splashing onto Russo's suit shoulder and freezing him in place. "I'll say this once and I won't repeat it," Raphael said, his voice still controlled, but each word landing like a stone on the chests of the men in the room. "Ms. Monroe is a member of my household. She takes care of my son. And anyone who dares open their mouth to gossip about her will receive a bullet to the head instead of a glass against the wall. Do we understand each other?" 11 "yes, boss" responses rang out almost in unison, including from a trembling Russo. Raphael stood and walked out of the room, leaving behind a group of frightened men and a wall stained with whiskey. On the drive home, Griffin drove in silence, but Raphael knew exactly what his right hand was thinking. He had defended Hazel in front of all the captains. He had put his reputation on the line for a nanny, and in this world, that was a statement louder than any words. He wondered when he had started seeing her as someone who needed protection rather than just an employee. After smashing the whiskey glass at the meeting, Raphael knew the rumors wouldn't stop, but at least no one would dare say them to his face anymore. What worried him more were the probing looks now being aimed at the Lake Forest mansion, and he didn't want Hazel to have to endure them. One Sunday afternoon, when golden sunlight poured through the maple trees, Raphael walked into the living room where Hazel was playing with building blocks with Asher on a thick wool rug. "Come outside with me for a moment," he said. Not quite a command, but not a suggestion either. Hazel looked up at him in surprise, but she didn't ask anything, only lifted Asher into her arms and followed him through the glass doors leading to the back garden. The garden behind the Lake Forest mansion was a completely different world, enclosed by hedges more than 3 meters tall and free of any security cameras at Isabel's request while she was still alive. She had said it was the only place in the house where she could breathe without feeling watched. Raphael hadn't set foot in this garden since Isabel died. The pain of seeing the rose bushes she planted, the wooden swing where she used to sit and read, all of it had been too much for him to bear. But today he wanted Asher to see the place his mother had loved, and perhaps he also wanted to be somewhere no one could see him except Hazel. They spread a blanket beneath a large maple tree, Asher crawling everywhere across the lush green grass, his tiny fingers clutching blades and laughing when they snapped in his hands. Hazel sat on the blanket, her green eyes following every movement of the child with a tenderness Raphael found he couldn't look away from. "She likes this place," he said, not as a question. Hazel nodded and answered that it was peaceful, as if the outside world didn't exist. "That's why my wife loved it here," Raphael said, surprised that he could mention Isabel without the sharp pain he usually felt. Hazel turned to him, her eyes carrying something he couldn't quite decipher. "Do you ever want to live a different life?" she asked suddenly. "A normal one without all of this." Raphael was silent for a long moment, watching his son reach for a yellow butterfly fluttering past. "This is my inheritance," he said. "My father built this empire from nothing. He died protecting it, and I took it over when I was 22. I didn't have another choice." "Everyone has choices," Hazel said gently. "Sometimes we're just too afraid to see them." Raphael looked at her as the sunset began to stain the western sky red, and in that amber light, Hazel looked like a painting made from the warmest colors imaginable. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. "That people can change?" "I have to," Hazel replied, her voice distant, "because otherwise the pain I went through wouldn't mean anything." They sat in silence for a while, Asher crawling back toward her and trying to climb her legs, his happy babbling breaking the heavy air. Hazel lifted him and settled him in her lap, her hands steadying his squirming body, while her mouth curved into a soft smile. And Raphael, not knowing what possessed him, perhaps the sunset was too beautiful, perhaps her smile was too warm, perhaps the loneliness he'd carried for too long finally caught up with him, raised his hand and touched her cheek. Hazel froze, her green eyes widening at him, but she didn't step back. "Raphael," she whispered, the first time she had spoken his name without adding "sir." "I know," he answered, his voice rough. "I know this is insane. I know you're my son's nanny. I know my world is dangerous and you deserve happiness somewhere else. But I can't stop thinking about you." He leaned closer, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Hazel stayed still, only her breathing quickening slightly. And then his lips met hers. The kiss began softly, a feather-light touch like falling petals. But then Hazel lifted a hand to grip his collar and pull him closer, and the kiss deepened, hotter, filled with long, restrained desire. Raphael could taste strawberry on her lips, feel her heart racing beneath the thin fabric of her clothes, feel her small hand trembling against his chest. Asher babbled something, and Hazel startled back, breathing hard, her lips flushed and her eyes shimmering with tears she tried to hold in. "We can't," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Why?" Raphael asked, his hand still cupping her cheek. "Because I'm your son's nanny," Hazel replied. "Because you're a mafia boss and I'm the daughter of an alcoholic from the South Side. Because your world and mine can never cross. Because if I let myself love you, I'll lose everything again, and this time I'm not sure I could stand back up." She rose, lifting Asher, who had begun to grow sleepy, in her arms. "I'm sorry," she said without turning back, and then she walked away, leaving Raphael alone in a garden sinking into darkness, with the taste of the kiss still on his lips, and a heart that had just awakened only to be refused. After the afternoon in the garden, Hazel tried to keep her distance from Raphael, but that was nearly impossible when they lived under the same roof and cared for the same child. She avoided meeting his eyes, avoided being alone with him, avoided any moment that might make her heart weaken again, yet her heart refused to listen to reason. She still tasted that kiss whenever she closed her eyes, still remembered the way his hand had touched her cheek, still heard the rough edge in his voice when he said he couldn't stop thinking about her. But she knew she had been right to stop. Their worlds didn't belong together, and if she allowed herself to love him, she would only be crushed the way her brother had been crushed by that same underworld. Miranda Vance knew nothing about Hazel's inner struggle, but she didn't need to. She only needed one opportunity to destroy, and that opportunity arrived in the form of a newly hired young butler named Derek. Derek needed money to pay off gambling debts, and Miranda was willing to pay 10 times his monthly wage for a single thing: photographs. He had taken them that very afternoon when Raphael and Hazel were sitting in the back garden, when his hand rested on her cheek, when their lips met beneath the sunset. The pictures were sharp down to every detail, enough to tell the story Miranda wanted the world to believe. 3 days later, the scandal exploded like a bomb. Raphael was in a meeting with his lawyers when Griffin called with rare tension in his voice and said he needed to see this immediately. On the phone screen was the front page of the Chicago Tribune, with a bold headline that read, "The Carmine Boss and the Mysterious Nanny Romance or Conspiracy." The garden photos displayed clearly beneath it, along with a 3-page article digging into every corner of Hazel Monroe's life. They knew she had grown up on the South Side. They knew her mother had been an alcoholic who died of liver failure. They knew she had lived in a homeless shelter after her brother died. They had even uncovered images of her from that time, gaunt and unkempt, with the hollow eyes of someone who had lost all hope. The article labeled her a gold digger, a professional bed climber, the daughter of a drunk trying to change her fate by seducing a billionaire. They quoted anonymous sources claiming she had been involved with at least 2 former employers, that she deliberately tried to get pregnant to trap wealthy men, that she was a danger who needed to be removed. Raphael finished reading and felt fury erupt in his chest like a volcano. He knew who was behind all of it, Miranda and Pierce Sinclair, but what frightened him more was Hazel. He drove back to the mansion at nearly illegal speed and found her in Asher's room, sitting on the floor with her phone in her hand, the screen displaying that article. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it, and when she looked up at Raphael, he saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "They found everything," she whispered, her voice cracking like glass. "They posted pictures of me from the shelter. They wrote about Jonah. They said I'm trash, a gold digger." Raphael dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands closing around her trembling ones. "Don't believe anything they wrote," he said. "It's all Miranda's lies. I'll find whoever took those photos and I'll make them pay." Hazel shook her head, tears still falling. "You don't understand," she said. "This isn't about Miranda or the lies. This is about my past being dragged into the open for the whole world to see, about them pulling Jonah through the mud even though he's dead, about me thinking I escaped the South Side only to realize it's going to chase me forever." She buried her face in her knees, her shoulders shuddering with broken sobs, and Raphael could only sit there holding her in his arms, feeling more helpless than he ever had before. He could kill enemies, he could destroy rival empires, but he couldn't erase her past or heal the wounds carved into her soul since childhood. 2 days after the scandal, Hazel made the decision she knew would tear her heart apart. She had spent 48 sleepless hours watching the poisonous comments multiply across social media, watching reporters begin to gather outside the gates of the Lake Forest mansion, watching Griffin double the security simply because of her presence. She was the source of all this trouble, and she knew that if she stayed, she would only drag Raphael and Asher down into the abyss with her. That evening, when Raphael had to leave to deal with an urgent matter tied to the Empire, Hazel knew this was her only chance. She found him in his office before he left, his face tight with lines of worry around his eyes she had never seen before. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice so calm it surprised even herself. Raphael looked up from the stack of papers, his gray eyes softening when they met hers. "What is it?" "I think I should leave," Hazel said plainly, without circling the truth, because she knew that if she hesitated for even a second, she wouldn't be able to say it. Raphael froze, the pen slipping from his hand and tapping softly against the desk. "What did you say?" "I don't belong in this world," Hazel continued, her voice trembling slightly though she fought to hold it steady. "Look at what's happened in just a few days. The scandal, the reporters, the rumors, all of it is because of me. If I stay, it'll only get worse. Miranda and Pierce Sinclair won't stop until they destroy everything. And I don't want Asher growing up surrounded by tabloid chaos because of his nanny." Raphael stood and walked toward her, his face a storm of emotions Hazel couldn't read. "Is this your decision, or are you running away?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm protecting you and Asher," Hazel replied. "I don't need you to protect me," Raphael snapped. "I can handle Miranda. I can handle Sinclair. I can handle the entire world if I have to. You don't have to leave." Hazel shook her head. tears rising in her eyes though she forced them back. "You can handle enemies on the outside," she said softly, "but you can't handle the truth that I'll always be a liability, a weakness your enemies can use, a source of scandal and disgrace. I'm a girl from the South Side. You're the Chicago boss. Those two worlds can never coexist." Raphael grabbed her arm, his eyes burning with something close to desperation. "You think I care about where you come from?" he asked. "You think I see you differently because you grew up poor?" "It's not you," Hazel whispered. "It's your world, your enemies, everyone around you. They'll never accept me, and I'll always be the stain on your perfect empire." Raphael's phone rang, Griffin telling him the emergency couldn't wait any longer. He looked at Hazel with eyes full of pain, torn between staying and leaving. "We'll talk when I get back," he said, his voice almost pleading. "Don't make any decisions until I return. Promise me." Hazel nodded, but she knew it was a lie. She had no intention of staying to let him talk her out of it, because she knew that if he looked at her like that one more time, she wouldn't be able to leave. Raphael walked out the door, turned back to look at her one last time, with a gaze she knew she would remember forever, and then he disappeared into the night. Hazel stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of his car fade away, and then she began to pack. She didn't have much, just a small suitcase with a few clothes and memories she couldn't take with her. At midnight, when the mansion had fallen asleep, Hazel slipped into Asher's room. The baby was sleeping soundly in the white crib, one hand resting on his belly, the other clutching the ear of the stuffed bear she had given him during her first week there. Hazel stood by the crib, looking at his angelic face through blurred tears. "I love you. Do you know that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you as if you were my own child. And that's exactly why I have to leave, because I don't want you growing up in scandal and chaos because of me. Please forgive me, Asher. Grow up healthy and happy. And never forget that somewhere in this world there's a woman who loves you to the marrow of her bones." She bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, her tears falling onto Asher's cheek. But he didn't wake. He only stirred slightly and went on sleeping. Hazel turned and left the room, every step feeling like 1,000 pounds crushing her feet. She left a letter on Raphael's desk, only a few short lines. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise. I'm leaving because I love Asher too much to watch him be hurt because of me. Please let him know that I love him, and that I always will, wherever I am." She set the letter down, placed beside it the small stuffed bear Asher loved most so he would still have something of her. Then she slipped out the back door and vanished into the Chicago night, leaving behind a mansion glowing with warm yellow light and two hearts she knew would shatter when the sun rose. Raphael returned to the mansion at 3 a.m. and found the letter on his desk. He read the lines over and over until they blurred before his eyes. Then he ran up to Asher's room with the fragile hope that she was still there, that this was only a nightmare. But Hazel's room was empty, the closet doors hanging open, nothing left behind except the faint scent of jasmine she used, lingering in the air like a cruel farewell. He stood there in the darkness, his hand crushing the letter until it wrinkled, and for the first time since Isabel died, Raphael Carmine felt completely powerless. The days that followed passed like an unending nightmare. Asher woke on the first morning and called Hayes, the tiny babble echoing through the empty room, and when no one answered, the baby began to cry. He cried all that day, cried until he collapsed into sleep, then woke and cried again. Edith tried to soothe him, but Asher pushed her away, his small gray eyes constantly searching the room for the familiar face he couldn't find. By the third day, Asher stopped babbling. The child who had once chattered all day now lay still in his crib, blank eyes staring at the ceiling, not responding when Raphael called his name, not smiling when Edith made silly faces, not reaching out to be held the way he used to. He began refusing food as well, turning his head away whenever the spoon approached, and Raphael was forced to watch his son grow thinner with each passing day, unable to do anything to stop it. Nights were true hell. Asher cried from sunset until dawn, not the cries of hunger or a wet diaper, but the cries of a child searching for something that had been taken away. Raphael stayed awake all night carrying his son around the room, singing the songs he remembered Hazel used to sing, but his hoarse, clumsy voice only made Asher cry harder. By the second week, Raphael called Dr. Richards to examine him. The elderly doctor looked at Asher with deep concern, checking every reflex, weighing him, observing how the child interacted with his surroundings. The conclusion landed like a knife in Raphael's heart. "The child is experiencing attachment disruption," Dr. Richards said. This happens when a young child loses the primary caregiver they've bonded with. At this age, the brain is developing rapidly, and a sudden loss can cause long-term consequences if there's no intervention. Raphael felt as if someone were squeezing his throat shut. "What kind of consequences?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Richards sighed. "If this continues, he may have delays in language development, difficulty forming trusting relationships later on. It can even affect emotional and cognitive development. I strongly advise you to find a way to bring the caregiver back, or at least allow the child frequent contact with her." Raphael stood by the window looking out at the Chicago night, his empire shaking under the war with Pierce Sinclair, enemies closing in from every direction, but all of it meant nothing while his son was withering day by day from missing a woman he had let slip through his fingers. He looked down at the phone in his hand. Hazel's number still there, but she never answered. Every message he sent vanished into silence like stones thrown into a bottomless abyss. He had people searching for her all over Chicago, but Hazel Monroe had vanished from the face of the earth without leaving a trace. And every night, when Asher cried in his arms and whispered a weak haze, Raphael knew he was losing his son piece by piece. The same way he had lost Isabel, the same way he had lost Hazel, and this time he didn't know what to do to stop it. While Raphael was struggling with Asher's condition, his enemies weren't standing still. Pierce Sinclair had waited years for this moment, and when he saw the Carmine boss distracted by scandal and the pain of losing the woman he loved, he knew the timing was perfect to strike. The first blow came on a night of driving rain, when 3 of Raphael's men were shot dead in a warehouse on the southern side of the city. No witnesses, no traces, only 3 bodies and a message written in blood on the wall saying, "Carmine is about to fall." Griffin brought the news to Raphael at 4 in the morning, his face pale as paper. "Russo, Martinez, and Chen," he said, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "They were shot in the head at close range. This was professional work, not street gangs." Raphael sat in his dark office, his gray eyes frozen as he listened. "Sinclair," he said, "not a question but a statement." "I believe so." Griffin nodded. "But that's not all. There's news from Miami. Harrison Vance has called our allies and announced he's cutting ties with the Carmine Empire. The official reason is that he needs to protect his family's interests after the scandal involving his daughter." Raphael let out a short laugh with no trace of humor. "Miranda," he said. She convinced her father. "There's more," Griffin continued grimly. "Our source in New York says Miranda Vance is living in Pierce Sinclair's penthouse. She's been sleeping with your enemy for weeks now, possibly even before you threw her out." Raphael stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago sky slowly beginning to lighten. He'd known Miranda was venomous, but he hadn't imagined she was this poisonous. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted to destroy him completely, to take the empire his father had built with blood and tears. In the days that followed, war erupted across Chicago. Sinclair seized 3 Carmine territories in the eastern districts within a single week, killed 7 more of Raphael's men, and burned 2 warehouses to the ground. Allies began to waver. Some quietly reached out to Sinclair to test the waters. Others stayed silent, waiting to see who would win before choosing a side. Raphael fought back with everything he had, but his mind wasn't fully there. Every night he still went home to hold a crying Asher, still watched his son refuse food and lie motionless like a lifeless doll. He was fighting on 2 fronts at once, one against enemies outside and one against the pain inside, and he didn't know how much longer he could endure it. 1 week after the first attack, Raphael received a photograph on his phone. It showed Miranda in a stunning red dress standing beside Pierce Sinclair at a lavish party in Manhattan. She was smiling, the triumphant smile of someone who had achieved her goal. Along with the photo came a short message saying, "I told you you'd regret it, Raph. Now watch your empire burn." Raphael stared at the image for a long moment, then hurled the phone against the wall with all his strength. The screen shattered, but it didn't lessen his anger, didn't ease his pain, didn't bring Hazel back, didn't stop Asher from crying, didn't slow the enemies tightening their grip around him day by day. He stood there in the wrecked office, a mafia boss losing everything. His empire, his son, the woman he loved, and he didn't know what to do to stop the collapse that was advancing step by step. On the 21st night since Hazel left, Raphael sat alone beside Asher's crib at 2 in the morning. Outside the window, Chicago was drowning in rain, the drops striking the glass like funeral drums for a collapsing empire. Asher lay in the crib, gray eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, not crying, not babbling, just lying there with the emptiness of a child who had given up searching. Seeing his son like this hurt more than hearing him cry through the night. Raphael reached into the crib and gently touched Asher's tiny hand. But the baby didn't react. Didn't curl his fingers around Raphael's the way he used to when Hazel was still here. He remembered the nights when Hazel sat in this very chair, singing lullabies in her warm, low voice, and Asher would close his eyes with a peaceful smile on his lips. He remembered the melody, a simple song about stars and the moon that Hazel said she had learned from her mother before the woman became lost to alcohol and forgot how to love. Raphael took a deep breath and began to sing. His voice was rough and clumsy, nothing like Hazel's, off-key and probably wrong in places. But he tried for his son, tried because it was the only thing he could do while the world collapsed around him. He sang about little stars in the sky, about the moon watching over good children as they slept, about a brighter tomorrow waiting somewhere ahead. His voice trembled and broke at times as emotion surged up, but he didn't stop. And then something miraculous happened. Asher turned his head toward him, his small gray eyes showing light for the first time in 3 long weeks. The baby looked at him, his lips moving as if trying to form a sound, and then a weak whisper filled the silent room. Hayes. Raphael stopped singing, his heart tightening painfully. His son had spoken, for the first time after 3 weeks of silence, and the first word he uttered was the name of the woman Raphael had let slip away. Hayes, Asher repeated, his voice faint and aching, and then his eyes filled and tears rolled down his cheeks. Raphael bent down and lifted his son, holding him tightly against his chest as tears began to fall down his own face. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I know you miss Hazel. I miss her too. I promise I'll bring her back. Do you hear me? I promise. Asher cried in his arms. Not the desperate crying of the previous nights, but the crying of a child being comforted, of a child hearing what he needed to hear. And Raphael sat there holding his son, finishing the broken song, until Asher finally fell asleep close to 4 in the morning. Outside the room, Edith stood quietly watching. The housekeeper had witnessed everything. Hazel's arrival, Asher beginning to smile again, the scandal, Hazel's departure, and the child's complete collapse. She had seen Raphael, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, kneeling beside his son's crib and crying like an ordinary father. And she knew what she had to do. Edith returned to her room and took out the old phone she kept hidden in a drawer. She had secretly saved Hazel's number before she left, an instinct of a woman who had lived long enough to know that sometimes people made the wrong decisions for the right reasons. She opened the camera and took a picture of Asher asleep in Raphael's arms, the baby's face still streaked with tears, far thinner than 3 weeks earlier, pale and fragile like a candle about to burn out. She sent the photo with a short message saying, "The baby needs you. He just said your name for the first time in 3 weeks. Please come back before it's too late." She didn't know if Hazel would receive the message, didn't know if she would read it, didn't know if she would care, but she had done everything she could. The rest was up to Hazel. And Edith could only pray that the young woman still loved the child enough to place that love above her fear and pride. Hazel was sitting in a small weekly rental apartment on the outskirts of Chicago when Edith's message arrived. For the past 3 weeks, she had lived like a ghost, working night shifts at a small private clinic to avoid running into anyone who might recognize her from the scandal, sleeping during the day in a dark room with the curtains tightly drawn, and trying not to think about Asher or Raphael, even though they appeared in her dreams every single night. She had turned off her old phone and bought a new number, cutting off all contact with the past as if that could somehow help her forget. But Edith had somehow found her new number anyway. Hazel stared at the message glowing on the screen, her heart pounding as she read the short lines. Then the photo finished loading, and it felt as if someone had punched her straight in the chest. Asher in the picture was no longer the chubby, smiling baby she remembered. He was so thin, his cheekbones stood out, dark circles shadowed his gray eyes, his face was pale, and the tracks of tears were still wet on his cheeks. She zoomed in and saw Raphael holding him, his face just as haggard, stubble covering his jaw as if he hadn't shaved in days, and the gray eyes that had once been cold as steel were now bloodshot from lack of sleep, and perhaps from crying. Hazel sat on the bed and sobbed, the phone shaking in her hands. She had believed leaving was the right decision, that she was protecting Asher from scandal and chaos. But look at what she had done. She had destroyed the child she loved with her own absence. She remembered what Dr. Richards had said at the last checkup before she left, about the importance of attachment in young children, about the long-term consequences when that bond was abruptly broken. She was a nurse. She knew all of this. And yet she had still walked away out of fear, out of pride, out of a lack of courage to face a world that was laughing at her. Hazel didn't sleep that night. She lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything. About Jonah and how she hadn't been able to save her brother. About Asher and how she was repeating that same mistake by abandoning him when he needed her most. And when dawn finally broke, she made her decision. She would go back, not for Raphael, not for money or status, but for Asher. For the child she loved as her own who was wasting away from missing her. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase and took a taxi to Lake Forest. When the car stopped at the mansion gates, Hazel saw that security had been increased several times over. At least 6 men dressed in black stood guard, and cameras were installed everywhere. She stepped out with her heart racing, unsure if they would even let her in, unsure if Raphael would want to see her after she had left without a word. One of the guards recognized her and spoke into his radio, and a few minutes later Griffin appeared at the gate. Raphael's right hand studied her for a long moment with an unreadable expression, then nodded and signaled for the gate to open. "The boss isn't home," Griffin said as he led her inside, "but the child needs you. Go to his room." Hazel didn't need to be told twice. She ran up the stairs as fast as her legs could carry her, her heart pounding as she reached Asher's door. She pushed it open and saw Edith sitting by the crib. The housekeeper looked up, and when she saw Hazel, her eyes filled with tears. "You came back," she whispered, then stood and quietly stepped out to give them privacy. Hazel went to the crib and looked down at Asher. The baby lay there with gray eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling just like in the photo Edith had sent. "Asher," she called softly, her voice trembling. The baby turned his head toward her, and in that instant, Hazel saw his small gray eyes widen in disbelief, as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. "It's Hazel," she said as tears began to fall. I'm sorry I left. I won't leave you again. I promise." She bent down and lifted Asher. He was much lighter than she remembered, thin and fragile like a baby bird. And then the second miracle in 24 hours happened. Asher wrapped his tiny arms around her neck, buried his face in her shoulder, and laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a small giggle, but it was the most beautiful sound Hazel had ever heard in her life. She held him tight and cried. From relief, from joy, from guilt, from love. They stayed that way for a long time, Hazel rocking Asher gently and singing the lullaby she had sung every night before. And the baby lay quietly in her arms with a peaceful smile on his lips, his small fingers clutching her collar as if afraid she might disappear again. Raphael came home near evening. Griffin had told him Hazel was back, but he hadn't dared believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. He climbed the stairs with his heart racing and stopped at Asher's door. The sight before him stole his breath. Hazel was sitting in the armchair by the window, Asher asleep in her arms, one of the baby's hands still gripping her collar, and on his lips was the smile Raphael hadn't seen in 3 weeks. Hazel looked up, and their eyes met across the room bathed in sunset light, and Raphael found himself unable to speak, standing there like a fool with a heart that was breaking and healing at the same time. Asher was asleep in his crib by 9 in the evening, one small hand still gripping the edge of Hazel's shirt, as if afraid she would disappear if he let go, and Hazel had to gently pry each tiny finger loose and slip the teddy bear into his hand instead, the baby stirring once before, settling back into sleep with a peaceful smile on his lips. She stood by the crib for a long moment, watching his chest rise and fall evenly, then turned and saw Raphael still standing in the doorway, his gray eyes never leaving her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and exhausted. Hazel nodded and followed him downstairs, along the long hallway lined with expensive oil paintings, into the library where they had once talked through the night when Asher had a high fever. Raphael poured her a glass of water and himself a glass of whiskey, and they sat opposite each other in the leather armchairs, the warm yellow light from an antique lamp casting sharp, weary lines across their faces. Silence stretched between them, neither knowing where to begin, until Raphael spoke. "Everything changed after you left," he said evenly, as if recounting someone else's life. "Pierce Sinclair attacked my empire. 10 of my men are dead. Harrison Vance cut ties. Miranda is living with Sinclair now, and they want to destroy everything I've built." Hazel stared at him. She knew something was wrong from the tightened security around the house, but she hadn't realized it was this bad. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Of course you didn't," Raphael replied. "You were busy running away." The words landed like a slap, and Hazel felt she deserved it. She lowered her gaze to the glass in her hands, unsure what to say. For 3 weeks I've been living in hell, Raphael went on. Asher stopped talking, stopped eating, stopped smiling. The doctor said he has attachment disruption, and it could affect him for life if it isn't addressed in time. I tried to find you all over Chicago, but you vanished. And every night I had to watch my son fade away without being able to do anything. His voice broke at the end, and Hazel saw him swallow hard, trying to hold himself together. She set the glass down and looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought leaving would protect Asher from scandal and chaos. I never imagined it would hurt him this much. She told him about her own 3 weeks, the dark little apartment on the outskirts, the sleepless nights missing Asher, the way she tried and failed to forget, about the photo Edith sent, and how it shattered every wall she'd built around her heart. I looked at that picture and realized I was wrong, Hazel said. I thought I was protecting Asher, but I was really protecting myself. I was afraid of being hurt, afraid of loving and losing again, afraid your world would crush me the way it crushed my brother. And because of that fear, I hurt the child I love most in this world. Raphael watched her, the hardness in his gray eyes softening slightly. Then why did you come back? He asked. For Asher or for something else? Hazel was silent for a moment, knowing this was the turning point. She could lie and keep a safe distance, or she could be honest and risk rejection, pain, being broken all over again, but she'd run enough. For Asher, she said, then lifted her head and met his gaze. And for you, because I can't stop thinking about you, no matter how hard I try, because every night I dream of you, and every morning I wake up with an empty heart because you aren't there. Because I love you even though I know it's crazy and dangerous and might destroy me. Raphael stood and walked toward her, each step echoing through the silent library like a countdown. He stopped in front of her, looking down with eyes burning with something Hazel didn't dare name. Do you know how angry I was when you left? He said hoarsely. I wanted to drag you back and lock you in. I wanted to scream at you for making that decision without asking me. I wanted to hurt you the way you hurt me and Asher. Hazel swallowed, her heart racing. But then I realized, Raphael continued as he dropped to his knees in front of her, so they were eye to eye. I was angry because I love you, because for the first time since Isabel died, I let a woman into my heart, and you walked away. Do you know how much that hurt? I do, Hazel whispered, because I feel the same way. They held each other's gaze in silence, two broken souls finding each other in the dark, and then Raphael lifted his hand to the back of her neck and pulled her to him. This kiss wasn't gentle like the one in the garden. It was full of longing and desperation, filled with long, lonely nights and the pain of abandonment, heavy with promises and commitments that didn't need to be spoken aloud. And this time, no one stopped. 1 week after the night in the library, everything seemed to be slowly getting better. Asher had begun eating normally again. The baby babbled more, and his smile had returned to his face, which was growing round and full once more. Raphael still had to deal with the war against Pierce Sinclair, but every night he came home and found Hazel waiting, and that gave him the strength to keep fighting. They had not put a name to what they were, had not spoken formal words of love, yet they both knew there was an invisible bond tying them together, something that could not be undone. That afternoon, Hazel asked permission to take Asher to a small park, about 10 minutes' walk from the estate. Dr. Richards had said that sunlight and fresh air would help the baby's recovery, and Hazel herself had been confined inside the mansion for far too long. Griffin assigned 2 men to follow and protect them, but Hazel did not know that one of those 2 had already been bought by Miranda weeks earlier, waiting patiently for this exact moment. The park was peaceful in the late afternoon, with only a few mothers pushing strollers and an elderly couple sitting on a bench feeding pigeons. Hazel set Asher down on the grass and let him crawl around, giggling as the blades tickled his tiny palms. She sat on the blanket watching him with a heart full of happiness, completely unaware that everything was about to collapse. The traitorous guard gave a signal to his accomplices, and before Hazel could react, 3 black vans appeared from 3 different directions, blocking every exit. The loyal guard drew his weapon but was shot down instantly, the silenced gunfire no more than a soft pop in the quiet afternoon. Hazel screamed and lunged for Asher, clutching the baby tightly to her chest as 6 men dressed in black surrounded her from all sides. "Do not resist and no one else gets hurt," one of them said in a cold, emotionless voice. "Take her and the baby to the van." Hazel bit the hand of the first man who tried to pull Asher from her arms. She kicked and clawed like a feral animal protecting its young, but she was only one woman against 6 large men. A blow to the back of her head sent her reeling, and when she came to, she was lying on the cold floor of a vehicle speeding through the night, Asher screaming in her arms. They were taken to an abandoned industrial warehouse in the southern outskirts of Chicago, where the smell of old machine oil and dust clung thickly to every surface. Hazel was thrown into a small room with Asher, the metal door slamming shut behind her with a sound like a death knell. She sat in the darkest corner of the room, holding Asher tight against her chest, the baby having cried himself to exhaustion and now only sobbing weakly. "Shh, my love," she whispered into his ear even as she herself trembled with fear. "Hazel is here. I will protect you. I promise." She did not know how much time had passed. Maybe 1 hour, maybe 3. Time had lost all meaning in the windowless room under the flickering neon light overhead. Then the door opened, and familiar footsteps echoed across the concrete floor, the sharp click of high heels that Hazel would never forget. Miranda Vance entered the room as if stepping into a cocktail party, her tight red dress and vivid red lipstick standing in grotesque contrast to the filthy surroundings. She looked at Hazel, curled in the corner with Asher in her arms, and smiled a poisonous smile. "Look what we have here," Miranda said in a falsely sweet voice, "the little nanny and the annoying brat. I must say I was quite surprised to hear you came back. I thought the scandal would have been enough to drive you away for good." Hazel said nothing. She only held Asher tighter and stared at Miranda with naked hatred. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice trembling slightly but still forcing itself to stay steady. Miranda laughed and stepped closer, her amber eyes cold as ice. "I want everything that should have been mine," she replied. "The Carmine Empire, the money, the power, and I want Raphael on his knees begging while I take away everything he loves." She looked down at Asher trembling in Hazel's arms and smiled cruelly. "Starting with this baby." Hazel pulled Asher behind her, using her own body to shield him from Miranda's gaze. "You will have to step over my dead body first," she said, her voice cold and hard as steel even though her heart was pounding wildly with fear. Miranda raised an eyebrow in amusement. "You are brave," she said, "but bravery will not save you from what is coming. Pray that Raphael loves you enough to pay the price I demand, because if he does not, this child will be the first to pay." She turned and walked out, the sound of her heels fading away like the countdown of a bomb about to explode. Hazel sat there in the darkness, clutching Asher to her chest, and for the first time she truly prayed, praying that Raphael would find them before it was too late. Raphael was in the middle of a meeting with his captains when Griffin burst in, his face white as a corpse. "Boss," he said, his voice trembling for the first time in the 20 years Raphael had known him. "Hazel and Asher have been kidnapped. They just sent a video." Raphael's world collapsed in that instant. He snatched the phone from Griffin's hand and hit play, and on the screen was Hazel sitting in the corner of a filthy, dark room, clutching Asher tightly in her arms, her green eyes full of fear yet forcing calm so the baby wouldn't panic further. Miranda's voice came from off-camera, sweet and poisonous, like venom. "My dear Raphael," she said, "I have what you love most. If you want to see them alive, transfer $50 million to the account I'll send, and give up control of the southern Chicago territory to Pierce Sinclair. You have 24 hours. After that, I'll send you the baby piece by piece, starting with those tiny fingers." The video ended, and Raphael stood frozen. Then something inside him ignited, a dark, primal fury he had never felt before, not even when his father was murdered, not even when Isabel died. He turned to the men in the room and they recoiled from his gaze. Gray eyes no longer cold like steel but burning like hellfire. "Find them," Raphael said, his voice only a whisper, yet carrying the weight of death. "Use every resource, every contact, everything we have. I want their location within 12 hours, and anyone who stands in the way will die." The next 24 hours were hell on earth. Raphael didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't rest for a single second. He personally interrogated every source, and his methods made even the hardest gangsters break. He captured the traitorous guard within the first 6 hours, and what he did to him in the dark basement beneath an Italian restaurant can't be put into words, only that the man confessed everything before he died, including the location of the warehouse where Hazel and Asher were being held. Griffin had never seen Raphael like this, not even in the darkest days of gang wars when his father was alive. His boss had become something no longer fully human, a killing machine driven by love and desperation. Exactly 24 hours after receiving the video, Raphael led a strike team of 20 men to the abandoned industrial warehouse in the southern outskirts. He didn't wait for a detailed plan, didn't wait for negotiation. He kicked in the main door and charged in like a demon unleashed from hell. Gunfire thundered through the warehouse. Muzzle flashes tore through the darkness. Screams and bodies hitting the ground echoed in the vast space. Raphael shot without hesitation, every bullet finding its mark, and he didn't stop until he reached the back room where intelligence said Hazel and Asher were being held. He kicked the metal door open, and what he saw stopped his heart for a moment. Hazel was in the corner, the back of her shirt soaked red with blood from a wound in her shoulder, yet she was still using her body to shield Asher from two kidnappers aiming guns at them. The baby was screaming in her arms, and Hazel, bleeding and shaking with pain, was still singing broken lullaby lines to calm him. Raphael didn't speak. He raised his gun and fired twice, and the two kidnappers dropped before they could react. Then he ran to Hazel, dropped to his knees, and pulled her and Asher into his arms. They were here. They were alive. They were safe. Raphael held the two most important people in his life and said nothing. Couldn't say anything, as silent tears fell down his cheeks for the first time since Isabel's funeral. Hazel looked up at him, her green eyes full of tears yet bright with relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice weak from blood loss. "I knew you would." Raphael held her tighter, careful not to touch the wounded shoulder. "I'll always come," he said hoarsely. "Even if I have to walk through hell, I'll find you." Griffin appeared at the doorway and reported the area was secure. Miranda and most of the kidnappers had fled when the shooting started, but several had been captured for questioning. Raphael nodded without taking his eyes off Hazel and Asher. "Call a doctor," he ordered, "and prepare the armored vehicle to take them home." He lifted Hazel, who still refused to release Asher from her arms, and they walked out of the dark warehouse into the first light of dawn. In the car on the way back, Asher finally fell asleep from exhaustion, and Hazel rested her head on Raphael's shoulder, her wound roughly bandaged but her body still weak. "I almost lost you," Raphael whispered into her hair, his voice cracking like glass. "I almost lost both of you." Hazel squeezed his hand with her uninjured one. "But you didn't," she replied. "We're still here. We're still here." Raphael kissed her forehead and held her tighter, a vow forming silently in his heart that he would never let anyone hurt them again, even if he had to burn the entire world to do it. 2 weeks after the kidnapping, everything had changed completely. Raphael didn't just rescue Hazel and Asher. He also launched an all-out war against Pierce Sinclair and everyone behind the abduction. The Carmine Empire, once seen as weakened, rose like a phoenix from the ashes, with a level of power and brutality no one had witnessed before. Raphael poured every resource into this war, not for territory or money, but because they had dared to touch his family. Pierce Sinclair was found in his Manhattan penthouse after a week-long hunt. Griffin led the strike team, and the New York boss died with 6 bullets in his body. No witnesses, no evidence, only a clear message sent to every enemy of the Carmine Empire. Never touch Raphael's family. Harrison Vance, Miranda's father and former ally from Miami, wasn't lucky enough to die as quickly as Sinclair. Raphael had connections inside the FBI he had cultivated over many years, and with a few phone calls and some anonymously delivered evidence, Harrison was arrested on charges of cross-border arms trafficking. He was awaiting trial in a federal prison, facing a sentence of at least 30 years, enough to ensure he would die behind bars. Miranda was the most complicated case. She was captured 2 days after the rescue, while trying to flee to Mexico, and Raphael had full authority over her fate. He could have killed her, and no one would have objected. No one would have questioned it. That was the law of the underworld. But he chose a different path. Miranda was handed over to the police with complete evidence of kidnapping and conspiracy to murder a child, charges serious enough to put her in prison for at least 20 years. When Hazel heard this, she sat silently for a long time on the hospital bed where she was recovering from her shoulder wound. "Why?" she finally asked, looking at Raphael sitting beside her holding her hand. "Why didn't you kill her after everything she did? No one would have blamed you if you had." Raphael looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes carrying a softness she had never seen before. "Because I want to be worthy of more," he answered, his voice low and sincere. "My whole life I've lived by blood and violence. I've killed without blinking. I've done terrible things for power and money, but when I look at you and Asher, I want to be a better man, a man you and my son can be proud of." Hazel felt tears rise in her eyes. But Miranda deserved to die, she said quietly. She almost killed Asher. Maybe she did deserve it. Raphael nodded. But if I killed her, I wouldn't be any different from her. I want you to know I can change, that I can make different choices, that I'm not just the ruthless mafia boss the world believes I am. He paused and tightened his grip on her hand. I want to be worthy of you, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I know I'm not perfect. I know my past is full of sins. But I want our future to be different. I want Asher to grow up without living in the shadows the way I did. Hazel pulled him closer and kissed him, a gentle kiss full of love and forgiveness. You're already worthy, she whispered when their lips parted. From the moment you burst into that room to save us, you were already worthy. Raphael held her against him, careful not to touch her bandaged shoulder, and for the first time in his life, he felt that maybe he truly could change. Maybe the blood on his hands didn't have to define him forever. 2 months passed and the world of Raphael Carmine changed in ways he had never imagined. After the kidnapping and the fall of Pierce Sinclair, he began to do what he had first considered on that night in the library, turning the Carmine Empire from darkness toward the light. He sold off parts of the illegal operations to those willing to pay a high price, withdrew from smuggling and loan sharking, and invested in real estate, restaurants, and technology startups. Griffin said he was insane. The captain said he was weak, but Raphael didn't care. He had seen death up close when he almost lost Hazel and Asher, and that kind of moment changes a man in ways nothing else can. One early autumn evening, when the maple leaves in the garden began to turn a brilliant yellow-orange, Raphael asked Hazel to walk with him in the backyard. Asher was asleep in his crib under Edith's watch, and the mansion rested in the quiet glow of the setting sun. They walked along the stone path, leading to the wooden swing Isabel once loved, the place where Raphael had first kissed Hazel months earlier. He remembered promising himself he would never return here because the pain was too great. Yet now the garden was no longer a place that buried grief, but one that held new hope. Hazel stopped beside the rose bushes she had tended for weeks, the deep red blooms opening like small beating hearts. She turned and saw Raphael watching her with an unfamiliar look, his gray eyes soft and deep, in a way she had never seen. What is it? She asked, her heart skipping a beat. Raphael didn't answer. He slowly went down on one knee in the grass, and Hazel felt her breath catch in her throat. From the pocket of his jacket, he took a small black velvet box and opened it, revealing a simple ring with a tiny emerald that caught the light of the sunset. Not a flashy diamond he could easily afford, but a green stone the exact color of her eyes. Hazel Monroe, Raphael said, his voice low and trembling with emotion. I know I'm not worthy of you. I know my past is full of darkness and sin. I know my world has hurt you and the people you love, but I also know I love you more than anyone I've ever loved in my life. I love you because you taught me how to be better. Because you gave me hope when I thought there was nothing left but darkness. Because you loved my son like your own even though you never had to. Tears streamed down Hazel's face, but she didn't wipe them away. She only stood there looking at the most powerful man in Chicago kneeling before her like a man begging for grace. Do you know my brother died because of your world? She whispered, her voice not angry but heavy with sadness. Jonah was killed by people operating inside the system you ruled, and there was a time when I hated everything you represented. Raphael nodded, his eyes never turning away. I know, he said. Griffin told me about Jonah, and I also know my empire destroyed the gang that killed your brother 2 years ago even though I didn't know it then. I can't change the past. I can't bring Jonah back, but I can promise you I'll spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness. I'll build a future Jonah could be proud of if he were still alive. A future where our child won't grow up in fear and shadows. Hazel looked at him for a long time, searching the gray eyes burning with a sincerity she knew couldn't be faked. She thought of Jonah, of her brother's smile when he was young before life crushed him, of the promise she made to stay away from the underworld forever. But she also thought of Asher, of the way he called her mama, of the sleepless nights caring for him beside Raphael, of the first kiss in this garden and the second in the dark library, of the way Raphael stormed into a warehouse full of guns to save her and the baby, of the way he chose not to kill Miranda because he wanted to be better. Some things can't be forgiven, she said softly, and Raphael felt his heart sink. But there are also things that can't be denied, Hazel continued, her voice warming, like love, like family, like second chances that life sometimes gives to those who have lost everything. She knelt in front of him so they were eye to eye, both of them on the green grass in a garden flooded with golden light. "My answer is yes," Hazel said, tears still falling as she smiled. "I'll marry you, Raphael Carmine, not because you're rich or powerful, but because you showed me that even the darkest people can change, and because I love you, even though I tried not to." Raphael slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her, as if his life depended on it. And in the garden where he once mourned his lost wife, Raphael Carmine felt for the first time that he was truly forgiven, truly loved, and finally allowed to hope for a brighter future. The wedding took place on a spring afternoon, not in a grand church with hundreds of guests as people might expect from a Chicago kingpin, but in the garden behind the Lake Forest mansion where Raphael had proposed to Hazel. Only about 20 people attended, the ones who truly mattered to them. Griffin stood as a witness in a black suit that for the first time hid no weapon inside. Edith sat in the front row with a handkerchief already soaked with tears before the ceremony even began, and a few trusted friends Raphael believed in enough to invite into this private moment. There were no reporters, no cameras except for a single photographer, no extravagant display the world associated with the Carmine Empire. Hazel wore a simple white dress she chose herself, not the expensive haute couture Raphael offered to buy, just a soft lace gown she found in a small shop in downtown Chicago and loved at first sight. She walked down the aisle scattered with red rose petals, and when her eyes met Raphael waiting at the end, she saw him swallow hard and his gray eyes shimmer with tears. But the most beautiful moment came when Asher appeared, 26 months old and newly unsteady on his feet, holding a small pillow with the wedding rings. The child toddled step by careful step across the grass, gray eyes just like his father's fixed with total concentration on this important mission. And when he finally reached his parents without falling, the garden erupted in applause and laughter. "Dada, Mama," Asher babbled happily, lifting the pillow like a victory trophy. And Raphael scooped him up and kissed his round cheek, while Hazel wiped the tears streaming down her face. The officiant read the vows, and they exchanged rings, and when they were pronounced husband and wife, Raphael kissed Hazel amid cheers, a kiss full of promise for the future ahead. 1 year after the wedding, Raphael completed the transformation of the Carmine Empire into a fully legitimate operation. The days of blood and violence faded into the past, replaced by board meetings and financial reports. Griffin became the chief operating officer of Carmine Holdings, a diversified corporation with investments in real estate, fine dining, and technology. Former captains were retrained as managers and executives, and those who couldn't or wouldn't change were given generous early retirement packages. Some predicted Raphael would go bankrupt within a year if he abandoned the old path, but the opposite happened. His legitimate company proved even more profitable than the former underworld empire, and now he could sleep peacefully every night without fearing the FBI at dawn. Life in the Lake Forest mansion changed completely. Asher was nearly 3. An energetic, smiling boy with his father's black hair and clear gray eyes. He called Hazel Mama as naturally as if she had always been his mother, and every time she heard it, her heart warmed as if it were the first time. One Sunday morning, as the family ate breakfast in a sun-filled kitchen, Hazel placed a hand on her slightly rounded belly and looked at Raphael with a mysterious smile. "Do you want to know what name I've been thinking about for the baby?" she asked. Raphael looked up from his coffee, his eyes softening as he gazed at his wife's 3-month pregnant belly. The doctor had confirmed it was a girl, and they had discussed names without deciding. "I think I want to name her Isabel," Hazel said gently, meeting his eyes to read his reaction. Raphael stiffened, the name carrying so many memories, so much pain, so much lost love. Isabel, his first wife, Asher's mother, the woman who died too young and left a void he once believed nothing could fill. "I want Asher to grow up knowing about his birth mother," Hazel explained, her voice warm and sincere. "I want our daughter to carry her name as a way to honor the woman who gave birth to her brother, and I want you to know I never want to replace Isabel in your heart. I only want a place of my own beside her." Raphael stood and moved to Hazel, kneeling beside her chair and placing a hand on her belly. He looked up at her with eyes red from emotion. "You're the most extraordinary woman I've ever known," he whispered, "and Isabel would be proud to know someone like you is caring for her son and carrying her name for our daughter." Asher stopped eating and looked at his parents with concern. "Dada crying?" he asked softly. "No, sweetheart." Raphael smiled, wiping his eyes. "I'm just very happy." And in the kitchen flooded with morning light, the small family held each other, 3 soon to be 4, with a love strong enough to heal every wound of the past. The full moon hung bright over the Chicago sky, its gentle silver light spilling across the garden of the new mansion they had bought in a quiet suburb not far from Lake Forest. The old estate had been sold along with its dark memories, and this new house marked a completely fresh beginning for the Carmine family. Asher was sleeping soundly in his own room, decorated with glow in the dark stars on the ceiling and toy cars lined up neatly on the shelves. The boy, nearly 3 now, sleeping peacefully through the night, without nightmares or desperate cries like in those dark days after Hazel left. Hazel and Raphael sat on the new porch swing on the back veranda, rocking gently in the cool night breeze, her shoulder resting against his chest and his hand placed softly over her 6-month pregnant belly. They sat in silence for a long while, listening to crickets and rustling leaves, savoring a peace they both knew was priceless after everything they had endured. "Do you know what I used to think?" Raphael finally said, his voice low and deep in the quiet night. "Think what?" Hazel asked, tilting her head to look at him. "I used to think power was everything," Raphael replied. "I believed money and the fear others had of me were the measure of success. I built an entire empire on that belief. Killing, threatening, controlling, all for power." He paused and looked down at Hazel, his gray eyes unusually gentle. "But now I know I was wrong," he continued. "Power isn't everything. Family is everything. You, Asher, our daughter about to be born, waking up to our child's laughter, sitting like this with you in the evenings. Those are the things that truly matter, the things no empire or power can buy." Hazel took his hand and pressed a soft kiss to it. "You've changed so much," she said. "From the cold Mafia boss I first met into the man sitting beside me now. Because of you," Raphael answered without hesitation, "because you showed me that even someone like me is worthy of redemption, that the past doesn't have to define the future, that a sinner can still find a place to belong if he has the right person beside him." They sat there under the bright moon, 2 souls once broken who had found each other in the darkness and stepped into the light together. Hazel, a girl from the South Side with a poor childhood and a murdered brother, had found the family she thought she would never have. Raphael, a Mafia boss with blood on his hands and a heart turned to stone, had learned how to love and be loved in return. And little Asher, a child who once cried through the night from the absence of love, now slept peacefully with a smile, knowing he was loved unconditionally. In the moonlit garden, Raphael kissed Hazel's forehead and whispered his love into her hair. And they knew that no matter how dark the past had been, no matter how deep the wounds, love and family could heal everything. Because sometimes the most sinful are the ones most deserving of love, and sometimes home isn't where you're born, but where you choose to belong. The story of Raphael and Hazel reminds us that everyone is capable of change with enough love and courage, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the past, but choosing not to let it control the future, and that real family isn't defined by blood, but by the love we choose to give every day. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories together each day. How do you feel about Raphael and Hazel's journey? And in real life, do you believe that people who have made mistakes still deserve love and a second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly look forward to hearing what's in your hearts. Thank you for watching until the very end. We wish everyone viewing this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.